only a handful of politicians have ever flipped to the opposition. In the UK, Churchill defected from the Tories to the Liberals, only to go back to the Tories. In 2006, Canada's David Emerson flipped from the Liberals to the Conservatives, and in 1964, a South Carolinian senator called Strom Thurmond abandoned the Democrats and joined the Republicans. But in the history of Western democracies, only one person has led both of their country's major parties, Billy Hughes. But that actually isn't even the craziest bit. Not only did he lead the two opposing parties, but he led a different one in each world war. The guy spent half a century in Parliament, yet we know pretty little about him. That will change today.
They have evacuated Greece as their fathers evacuated Gallipoli, but their spirit is unbroken.
You're about to see a much more youthful version of me. The base of this video was filmed a year ago, and that video was alright, but I don't think it was great. And so what I've done is I've tweaked a whole bunch of it to try and make it a really great Billy Hughes documentary. If you are a long-term viewer, stick around because I think you'll enjoy the changes. So in 1988, Australia was commemorating 200 years of British Australian history, and we were kind of doing like a Watch Mojo top 200 contributors. Interestingly, what the committee couldn't actually determine was whether Hughes should be on there or not, because they couldn't decide whether he'd built the nation or destroyed the nation. Now, Hughes had always been a fiery character. For instance, when Alfred Deakin pulled his protectionists out of coalition with Labor to instead fuse with the Free Traders to form the Liberal Party, Hughes said, "I hear from this side of the house some mention of Judas. I do not agree with that. It is not fair to Judas, for whom there is this so be said. He did not gag the man whom he betrayed, nor did he fail to hang himself afterwards." Now, up until World War I, Hughes was Labor's number 2, playing second fiddle to a guy called Andrew Fisher. Fisher had only edged Hughes out by one vote in 1907, and for the first year of the war, the nation was led by Fisher. But things didn't go so well for him.
Commonwealth soldiers land on the beaches of Gallipoli to try and surprise the Turks.
So the famous Gallipoli landings were actually orchestrated behind Fisher's back by the British. With a stalemate on both the east and the west, First Lord of the Admiralty Winston Churchill ordered a new attack through the Dardanelles. Given that Australian troops were training over here in Cairo, it made sense for Australia to play a key role in the invasion. And with the Ottoman Turks neutralised, a supply route to Russia could open up, which would help them on the Eastern Front. So Fisher did eventually find out about the Gallipoli landings on April the 26th. If you know Anzac Day, you know that's actually one day after the Gallipoli landings took place. Yeah. Imagine like an Allied leader not knowing that D-Day was going to happen. So obviously the British were showing an incredibly disrespectful attitude towards Fisher, and it didn't help that he was starting to struggle with his health and showing some signs of going senile. So what about Billy Hughes? Where's he in all of this? Well, whereas Fisher was struggling, Hughes was thriving.
Many in the Labour Party believe that instead of Fisher, Hughes should be the leader.
For instance, in 1914, when Fisher went to New Zealand to coordinate Anzac forces, Hughes was acting Prime Minister, and his dynamism was a refreshing change of pace from Fisher's weariness. But it wasn't just that. Hughes had real policy accomplishments to point towards, particularly the creation of the Australian Metals Exchange. German factories had been huge purchasers of Australian metals, and so Hughes tasked himself with finding those metal companies a new market. So by the end of 1915, Australia had been unsuccessful in Gallipoli and were having to retreat. Fisher had been an incredibly effective peacetime Prime Minister, passing dozens of key laws, but with the early enthusiasm for the war waning, it really needed fresh leadership. So in October, a weary Fisher stood down, and there was no question as to who Labor would choose to replace him: Billy Hughes. But just a year later, those same people were calling for his head. So what on earth happened in between?
The man they call the Little Digger may be popular with the soldiers, but trouble beckons at home.
So one of Hughes' first moves was to head on over to Britain and France to get a glimpse of the Western Front. Now, Hughes spoke frequently of his youth, often emphasising one trait: he was hard as nails. His mum died when he was 6, and his dad then sent him to live in Wales with relatives. When he left the UK to come to Brisbane, he worked all sorts of jobs, even travelling from Brisbane to Rockhampton on foot. Point being that you don't mess with Hughes. Whereas Britain had pulled ones over on his predecessor, Hughes was adamant that they put more respect on Australia's name. So when Hughes arrived in London, he was quick to point out that Australia hadn't been properly consulted and that Britain was living as though it was still the 1800s. He also voiced a number of territorial concerns. Take Papua New Guinea, for instance. The southern part was formerly British and now Australian territory, however the northern part was German. When war broke out, Australia took this off of the Germans, and Hughes wanted a guarantee that they wouldn't get this back after the war. But there was also another more subtle concern: Japan.
Japan may be a crucial ally, but one question remains: can we truly trust the way of the samurai?
So ironically, Japan also helped take German colonies across this region here. For Hughes, this was getting too close to Australia's sphere of influence. Britain had been a close ally of Japan's, helping them industrialise during the Meiji Restoration. They were a different race, spoke a different language, and had a very strong military culture. Hughes' point was to be very careful as to who you made your friend. There was also some added complexity around the White Australia policy. It might surprise you to learn that Britain were actually opponents to Australia prioritising white migrants because it actually stopped free movement across their empire. However, Hughes in fact urged the British Empire to abandon free trade with the outside world and instead create a block of tariffs that excluded Germany. Britain was in quite an interesting position. Enthusiasm for the war was waning, particularly under its leader Herbert Asquith, and they'd had to resort to conscription. But the presence of Hughes provided them with a unique opportunity. What if the dynamic Australian leader promoted the war for them?
An excited crowd waits in Liverpool Town Hall as the Australian Hughes prepares to plead with them to continue their war effort.
With Hughes pressing Britain to go even harder against Germany, they wheeled him out across the nation to drum up support for the war. Remember, Billy Hughes spoke fondly of his days in Wales and struck up a close relationship with a guy called David Lloyd George. Basically, he was Britain's Minister for War and would later become Prime Minister himself. Hughes could see that George was destined to take over from Asquith, and so tried hard to build a rapport. Hughes' trip ended with a conference in Paris insisting that Australia get independent representation before making a trip to the trenches.
The man they call the little digger amongst the soldiers in the trenches.
The trenches had a profound impact on Hughes. By 1916, morale was low, and the Somme offensive had failed to be the breakthrough that Britain were hoping for. Having seen Britain introduce conscription, Hughes was convinced that Australia ought to follow suit, and upon return to Australia, floated the idea to his own party. The reaction was far worse than Hughes had calculated.
It's almost a certainty that the Labour Party will revolt against the man they chose to lead them only a year ago.
So when it came to conscription, the Liberal opposition was certainly for it, but the working class detested it for a number of reasons. The first was that they were very worried that their employers would use this as a chance to replace them with cheap foreign labour. This sentiment was only amplified by the fact that 2 ships of Maltese migrants were on their way over in late 1916. The fervour to support Britain had also been crushed by something else that happened in 1916.
The Sackville Street General Post Office in Dublin has now been seized by Irish Republicans.
The Labour Party had a huge Irish Catholic background, and with Britain quite strongly suppressing the Irish uprising, the idea that they'd then have to be forced to fight for Britain was one they hated. So if you look at the layout of Parliament in 1916, Hughes had no way of passing a conscription law through Parliament if his Labour Party wasn't going to go for it. However, he actually managed to persuade them into holding a plebiscite on the issue. A plebiscite's a public referendum, but is to change an act of Parliament rather than the Constitution. But we'll also use the word referendum because that was the one they used at the time. The reason that Labour went for the referendum was that they were very confident that the public would say no and end the conscription debate once and for all. Now, even before the vote went through, the reaction was pretty strong against Hughes. Key unions like the Wharf Labourers Union even expelled him. The day before the vote, Hughes then passed a regulation not to count the votes of men aged 21 to 35 who'd avoided the call to war, because according to Hughes, they were clearly incapable of voting impartially. The whole thing quite bitterly divided Australia, and so when the nation went to the polls, it wasn't good for Hughes. On the 28th of October 1916, 51.6% of Australians voted no to conscription, giving them a majority. It wasn't just an embarrassment for Hughes, but an embarrassment for the entire Labour Party, and so just 2 weeks after the vote, they called an emergency conference where this went down.
Billy Hughes has quit from the Labour Party, taking 23 others with him. The government is left in complete disarray.
So, including Hughes, 24 Labour members left to form a new party called National Labour. And if you look at the layout of Parliament here, that left no majority party. So instead, Hughes formed a coalition with the pro-conscription Liberal Party, and in February of 1917, the parties officially merged to become the Nationalist Party. Labour was left in the cold as Hughes had taken government away from them. But February 1917, at least according to the Julian calendar, was when something else happened in the war.
It's wild news coming out of Petrograd as Tsar Nicholas steps down, abandoning Russia in the middle of mankind's greatest war.
So the abdication of Tsar Nicholas in Russia threatened to collapse the entire Eastern Front against Germany. If that were to happen, all the German soldiers could be transported over here, and it could be game over. From Hughes' point of view, if Russia were to pull out of the war, then Australia and Britain needed to be ready to match those extra German numbers coming to the Western Front. But hold up, let's just stop there for a moment. There was no way that Hughes could actually increase recruitment because Australia had just literally rejected conscription. But you could always just try again.
What the actual Sigma? Australia looks poised to hold a second referendum on conscription just 1 year on from defeat.
Now, Hughes' idea for a second referendum may just seem plainly stupid, but it's worth noting what happened in May of 1917. Hughes' Nationalist Party won a landslide 53-22 victory at the election. Given the Nationalist Party was formed as a pro-conscription alliance, Hughes interpreted the election victory, at least in part, as Australia responding to the Russian Revolution. So Hughes went ahead and held a second referendum on conscription with a promise that if that were to be unsuccessful, he'd step down. And this referendum was far more ugly than the first. So of the Australian states, Queensland was the only one still under Labor control at the state level. So the Premier, Thomas Ryan, and his deputy, Ted Theodore, and a funny name, were quite outspoken against conscription. After a printed tract of Theodore's arguments made quite the circulation throughout Queensland, Hughes had the Queensland government's printing office raided. Then on the campaign trail, Hughes spoke in the town of Warwick in Queensland South. While there, Hughes got egged. But that's not even the funny bit. Hughes was so dissatisfied with the level of protection provided by the Queensland Police Force that he formed his own police force, the Commonwealth Police Force. Later on, that Commonwealth Police Force would merge with the ACT Police to become the AFP. So Americans, if you're wondering how we got our equivalent of the FBI, that's how. However, as Australia went to the polls again, it was another defeat for Hughes, this time more convincing than the first, 54-46%. But what about Hughes' promise to step down if unsuccessful? Well, in January of 1918, Hughes did step down, but was sworn in again on the same day. So if you know your World War I history, 1918 is getting very close to the end of the war. By this point, American forces were now on the Western Front, and by the middle of the year, the Germans were on the retreat. So as Hughes was preparing to go back to London for end of war talks, he actually took a detour past America to talk to President Woodrow Wilson. Now, having spoken to much of this audience, I know for a fact that a bunch of you are aspiring politicians that just so happen to be a little bit embarrassed that you don't know much about this history. Well, what I'd in fact say is don't be embarrassed. History is actually an opportunity to get an advantage over your competitors because you can put a policy into a context that your opponents can't. If you join the think tank, each month a new set of modules comes into your dashboard that goes into detail on one particular part of Aussie history. Not gonna lie, the Keating's economy modules were an absolute hit. I can also confirm that there are actually Labor candidates from the 2025 election that are also completing these modules. If you want to join the waitlist for specific one-on-one tutoring, just click this button right here as well. The link's in the description. Now, after Britain didn't exactly warmly receive Hughes' concerns in the Pacific, Hughes tried his luck with Wilson. After all, a growing Japanese presence in the Pacific would also greatly affect American interests too. The Hughes-Wilson relationship would be crucial come the peace conferences. In the dying stages of the war, Hughes once again made it into the trenches, earning the soldiers' respect as they called him the Little Digger. By November, the truce was signed, and the key leaders made their way to Paris to discuss terms.
The leaders of the victorious war effort gather together in Paris to decide the fate of the defeated.
But going into Paris, Hughes had two massive concerns. On the one hand, he had no confidence that Lloyd George would be able to advocate for Britain's dominions because he'd spent no time consulting Hughes. The second was that Woodrow Wilson came in with 14 conditions for peace, one of which was actually the removal of tariffs. This would be disastrous for Australian manufacturing because our factories couldn't compete with American or European ones. Australian factories relied on high taxes on imports to force Aussies to buy Australian-made. No one was going to fight on behalf of Australia, and if we were going to achieve anything at Paris, Hughes really had to step up. He made it clear to Wilson that he strongly disagreed with his tariffs. A much frustrated Wilson felt that Hughes was holding up the entire post-war negotiations and said that he was standing 5 million Australians against the 1.2 billion people from the other allied nations. Hughes simply replied, "I represent 60,000 dead." Now, the footnote to this story is that Hughes actually might not have heard Wilson correctly. He was known for having bad hearing and relied on a hearing aid, and he'd often just turn it off in conversation if he was losing interest in what the person said. Now, that would be surprising to do to the President of the United States, but Hughes was a pretty rare character. When it came to territory, Billy Hughes traded away islands that were north of the equator to Japan in order to try and get influence over the islands that were south of it. For instance, Hughes claimed that German New Guinea should belong to Australia until it reached a point where it could survive on its own. This was agreed to, and so German New Guinea then merged with the Australian-occupied Papua in the south to become Papua New Guinea. However, despite giving Japan territorial concessions, he didn't give them a moral one. You see, Japan proposed something called the Racial Equality Clause. It was pretty non-controversial, just something that would have said all races are equal. Billy Hughes said no. Think about it. Passing the clause would have meant undermining the basis of the White Australia policy. And Hughes' protest found fertile soil with Woodrow Wilson. Wilson was a Democrat, and in the 20s, the South was Democrat-run, which meant that they were the more pro-segregation party. Allowing the clause to go through would have actually alienated his own party, and so Wilson teamed up with Hughes to veto the Racial Equality Clause. The last demand that Hughes made was that Germany ought to pay big and supported France's call for tough reparations, which ended up happening. So having been successful on all of his demands, Hughes returned to London where he was hoisted on the shoulders of Anzac soldiers and greeted by a crowd of 500 Australians. But back at home, the reception wasn't anywhere near as warm.
Celebrations across the world remain somewhat muted. Soldiers are returning to now face a new danger, a pandemic.
So when Hughes returned, he returned to a struggling society. There was a global pandemic, a weariness of war, and an election coming up that year. With many elections in global history, once a crisis is over, voters often seek a new leader who represents normality. So not only did Hughes have to shrug off the image of wartime specialist, but he actually had to worry about a new party.
A collection of old farmers' unions, they are now gathered under a new name, the Country Party.
So the Country Party was a new minority party who felt that farmers weren't getting adequate representation in Parliament. We call them the Nationals today. And in 1919, a swing went against Hughes' nationalists as they lost 16 seats. However, Labor only picked up 4 seats. 11 of those nationalist seats instead went to the Country Party. As you can see, no party had a clear majority, and so Hughes had to form a coalition with this new Country Party. And regarding the peacetime government, there were some interesting things. He set up the CSIRO, founded the National Oil Refinery, and came to support Britain's alliance with Japan as a way of containing them. But in 1922, there was a Royal Commission into Working Conditions, and it found that the basic wage should be 40% higher. Of course, that was not endearing news to the public right before the next election. And in 1922, Labor picked up more seats than the Nationalists. But the saving grace for Hughes was that the Country Party's 14 seats could once again merge with the Nationalists' 26 seats to take down Labor. Unfortunately for Hughes, they had one demand for keeping the coalition. Hughes had to resign the leadership. Of course, Hughes rejected this proposal, and the Country Party clearly wanted someone they felt they could more easily control. But eventually, after copping enough internal pressure, Hughes resigned in 1923. By the way, John Barilaro actually looked up to L. Page. I'll tell you more at the end. But here's what's crazy. Hughes wouldn't leave office for another 20 years. That'd be like Paul Keating still being in Parliament today. Now, the Hughes story arc gets even wilder. So he was replaced by a guy called Stanley Bruce, and under Bruce, Hughes was relegated to just being a backbencher. But Hughes was far from irrelevant. At times, he'd even defect back towards Labor. The most notable example of this was when Bruce tried to abolish essentially what was the High Court for Industrial Matters. Hughes flipped to Labor and said that either a referendum or an election must come first. Sure enough, Bruce opted for an election against Labor, but just 2 years later, the Labor Party would splinter again.
Labor faces a crisis. An unholy alliance between Jack Lang and Joseph Lyons sees James Scullen's government decimated as the United Australia Party looks destined for victory.
So throughout 1931, the federal Labor government was attacked from both its right and its left. Jack Lang believed that the solution to the Great Depression was prioritising unemployment and injecting huge amounts of money into the economy to keep people in work. That money would come from abandoning its debt to Britain. When Scullen refused to abandon the debt and shunned Lang's New South Wales allies, Jack Lang deserted the party and formed Lang Labor. Like the video if you would have joined Jack Lang, or just like the video to help Billy Hughes become mainstream. However, more damage was dealt on Scullen's right. Labor's Joey Lyons believed that the solution to the Great Depression was by maintaining a good credit rating and restricting big amounts of spending. For Lyons, unemployment was a necessary evil. Given that Scullin's government was committed to injecting money into the economy, Lyons left the party and was invited by the opposition leader to be the leader of a new party called the United Australia Party. Now, Hughes supported this merger. After all, he was the one who coined the good old ditch Labour and join the opposition move. Also, if everyone did this right now, we could actually have an Aussie history podcast be the #1 history podcast in Australia. Every rating and follow helps catapult us to the top of the charts, and a couple of thousand would definitely get us there. We also have so many topics that aren't even covered on the main channel. Not even joking, it would actually mean so much to me if you paused the video right now, clicked follow, and gave it a rating. But when Hughes sided with Labour, he was actually expelled from the Nationalist Party. He then formed his own Australian party, but the formation of the UAP gave him a chance to get back into a majority party, and he snatched that opportunity. So in 1932, the UAP won a convincing election, making Joseph Lyons the Prime Minister. That was at least until this news story in 1939.
The Prime Minister has died from a heart attack. While the nation mourns, those within the coalition are wondering who will now take over.
So upon Lyons' death, there were only 2 real candidates for leadership of the party. The first was a guy you might have heard of called Robert Menzies, but the second was Billy Hughes. Just to reiterate, if Hughes would have emerged successful, he would have come back as Prime Minister. But the vote went mighty close, and Menzies only edged it out 23 votes to 19. Like, if just 3 UAP members changed their vote, we go into World War II with Billy Hughes once again our Prime Minister. So, not even 5 months after the leadership ballot, Poland was invaded by Germany, and Menzies led the government into World War II. During that time, Hughes served as Attorney General. But mid-war, we changed parties.
The Prime Minister has resigned this morning. While meeting with Churchill in London, it was no secret the United Australia Party was seeking to take him down.
So, facing a vote of no confidence from within, again, the course goes through Menzies' World War II performance, Menzies resigned the leadership. Now, the UAP Country Party coalition was dependent upon the support of 2 independents, Arthur Coles and Alex Wilson. Upon the UAP essentially knifing Menzies, they then flipped to support John Curtin's Labour government. What this meant was that the coalition was now in opposition and would be led by the smaller Country Party. Still, the UAP needed a leader, and up stepped the 80-year-old Billy Hughes. Now, during the war, Hughes served in Curtin's All-Parties War Council, much to the disapproval of his own party. By 1943, Curtin was proving to be an effective wartime leader, and Labour smashed the opposition in the election. The UAP went back to the drawing board, and not only let Menzies return as party leader, but he then led the entire opposition. Now, in 1944, the UAP's official policy was to not serve in Curtin's All-Parties War Council, but Billy Hughes went full Billy Hughes and rejoined the council, which then caused him to get expelled from the party. Again, that's 3 parties he's been expelled from now. Now, after the war, Menzies reorganised the party. There'd been too many alliances and mergers, and he wanted the party to go back to what it was before Hughes, the Liberal Party. As a token of peace towards him, Hughes was allowed to join the Liberal Party in 1945, with Menzies joking that he'd been a part of all parties at some time or another. And in 1951, Hughes was still serving in Parliament, winning the seat of Bradfield in the Upper North Shore. This was his 20th straight election win, and in 1952, Hughes was still going at 90 years old. That's pretty much 10 years older than Joe Biden is today. Now, 1952 would be the final year of Hughes as he died in office. He served 51 years, lasting from Queen Victoria to Queen Elizabeth, and was the second last inaugural federal politician to die. Having lived through half a century of Australian politics, he not only broke Labour himself, but was stabbed in the back by the Country Party. I told you that John Barilaro was a fan of Earl Page. He even tried the exact same manoeuvre on Gladys. This video right here shows you the entire history of the Nationalist Party, and in it, I actually argue that John Barilaro changed the party's playbook going into the 2020s. We've got your next video covered. Click right here.